Number 10. The Lancort Artillery Battery. During the infamous extended conflict known as the Cold War, countries near the Soviet Union had to have outposts to give them an early warning in case of a surprise attack. That's what's here in the now abandoned Lancort Artillery Battery on the southern Swedish island of Oja, originally designed to defend the shoreline against possible naval activity from the Soviet Union. There was a strategic location the country could use to defend the shore from Baltic Sea attacks, and it was necessary because they feared an invasion by the Russians was imminent. Many of the old defenses were replaced by new artillery batteries like this one, which also happens to be the one and only standing today. Back when it was built, it was one of the most advanced artillery systems on the globe. The cannon could fire with outstanding precision, with the gun itself protected by a huge dome and the operating facility hidden inside of a rock. The artillery battery was designed to withstand all attacks, including chemical, nuclear, and even biological. In the event of World War III, this artillery battery might have become one of the most crucial lines of defense and one of the most important naval passages in the world. Fortunately, it was never used, but you can still see the remnants today. The artillery battery guarded Sweden until the turn of the century, at which time these stations were decommissioned and dismantled except for one. It's now an overgrown ruin and a reminder of just how cold the Cold War really was. Number 9. Chapel of Our Lady of Victories. The Chapel of Our Lady of Victories in Portugal is one of the creepiest abandoned churches in the world, and yet it has a rather romantic story behind its desertion. It was built by a wealthy farmer and a botanist named José de Canto in honor of his wife after she died. Why does it always have to be about dead spouses? Something about that area, building a massive memorial to a deceased partner. It's really unsettling. Although it was a really magnificent structure, the chapel was built in the neo-Gothic style with stone and brick, stained glass windows, and it was erected right next to a beautiful lake. It was the perfect place for Jose to bury his wife after the chapel was consecrated in 1886. But there were no actual services held inside of the chapel. Instead, Jose used it as a mausoleum where his wife was buried. He then left orders for himself to be entombed beside his wife and for the church to be left alone. Ever since his death in 1898, the Chapel of Our Lady of Victories has been abandoned. It's still standing, but the lack of maintenance is clearly visible. What began as a romantic chapel for a man's dead wife has turned into a spooky and forgotten piece of Gothic architecture next to a serene lake, one of the most alluring and intimidating relics in all of Europe. Number 8. Allentown State Hospital. This bizarre building was not a place you wanted to be when it was operational, and certainly not a place you want to visit now that it has been abandoned. It first opened in 1912, and at the time, it was called the Allentown Homeopathic Hospital for the Insane. That doesn't really sound like the kind of place anyone would want to spend any amount of time, at least not voluntarily. The Allentown State Hospital closed in December of 2010 after being in operation for 98 years. The buildings here date back to the 1920s, and in 1954, the hospital had over 2,000 patients from the nearby county. That's a lot of crazy people. But it was also around this time that doctors began changing their tune about mental illness, suggesting that many people afflicted by diseases of the mind could still live in the community and be treated at home. And since pulling pieces of people's brains out of their noses and lobotomizing them wasn't really working out as a solution to mental illness, the hospital was slowly emptied and ultimately shut down and abandoned. But it remained abandoned for no more than a decade. The building was supposed to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places, but then the Pennsylvania Department of General Services decided to clear the building to allow a new development, and this was just in 2020. What could have been a spooky insane asylum haunting teenagers and adventure seekers for generations to come has now been bulldozed to make room for some boring apartment buildings. Do you support the decision to demolish the old buildings? They were historically valuable, but they were also abandoned and creepy, and possibly haunted. Tell me what you think in the comments below. Then, if you're enjoying this video, you should hit the subscribe button to stay connected with American Eye and get more awesome content. Number 7. The Lost Village of Haywood. The Lost Village of Haywood in Scotland was once prosperous and full of life, but like many ghost towns, something unexpected came and drained the town of its residents, one by one. It was once a thriving community of miners, but is today a ruin so forgotten that the people who live only 15 miles away don't even know it's there. The community here started in the 1800s, with the population being about 1,200 by the town's peak in 1890. The townsfolk built their homes out of bricks that were produced in a nearby brick factory. Though the factory had long since been torn down, the village developed, roads were installed, more people moved to the town, and they had all the normal amenities of a modern village. Official records showed that the village even had a soccer team that was undefeated in local leagues for 11 years. Haywood ended up being a producer of coal, and we all know how that turned out for everyone. The coal business began to dry up at the end of the 20th century, and since the area was unsuited for agriculture and there was no other industry, the population began to decline. By 1951, only 15 houses were left. Shortly after, Haywood was completely deserted. A few of the houses still remain today, as well as a small memorial commemorating the handful of inhabitants who died during both the First and Second World War. It was a total ghost town now, like many places in the world that rose and fell with the Industrial Revolution. Do you know of others? Let me know in the comments. Number 6. The Living Hell Prison. Croatia has a prison on an island that has been described as a living hell. The prison is just 2 miles from the coast, once used as a dumping ground for prisoners of war, then for political dissenters. It's called Goli Otok. The misery on the island prison began in 1948 when Cold War tensions in Europe began to rise. Josip Broz Tito, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, separated himself from the Soviet Union and then used Goli Otok as a labor camp. Those who still supported Soviet leadership or spoke positively about Joseph Stalin were sent to prison. According to National Geographic, the prison was active mostly between 1948 and 1955. By the beginning of 1956, over 15,000 people had been sent to the prison island, and at least 600 had been killed or simply allowed to die. The CIA described Goli Otok as Devil's Island. It didn't close its doors until the 1980s when the Iron Curtain crumbled. The Soviet Union fell apart, and Eastern Europe was finally able to reunite with the rest of the world. But history hasn't been erased here. The walls of the prison are still present, with the island completely deserted and largely ignored by Croatia because of its brutal past. It seems like they want to just brush it under the rug and haven't gotten around to bulldoze the whole place and turning it into something else. Number 5. Ukrainian churches in the prairies. Imagine an empty, cold flatland with scattered abandoned churches sitting just over the horizon, no matter which way you turn. No, it's not Siberia, it's Canada. From between the fall of 1891 and the summer of 1914, an estimated 170,000 Ukrainians immigrated to Canada from what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They moved primarily to the Canadian prairies, a vast landscape comprising 3 flat and mostly empty provinces of farmland: Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. They brought with them their beliefs, with most of them being Greek Orthodox Christians. One of the first churches to be built was St. Michael's Orthodox Church in Manitoba in the year 1897. Then there was another in Alberta, then another, and then another. But through the years, as society progressed, the Greek Orthodox religion fell out of style, and many of the churches were abandoned, as some people moved to cities and others stopped practicing their religion. Today, the Canadian prairies are dotted with rotting Ukrainian churches, many of them being of a strange design, mixed with Byzantine and Western styles. There are in fact hundreds of them, with only a handful left functioning. Rural Alberta in particular has dozens of disused Orthodox churches, just waiting until they fall apart completely. Number 4. Turkish Castle Town. There's a castle village in Turkey unlike anything you've ever seen, except maybe in a Disney movie. It's something that no one would ever expect to exist in real life. But it's true, and it's totally abandoned. Imagine a strange theme park, but one that didn't quite get finished. The village is literally filled with castles that look like they should be lived in by a king and queen. It's called Burj Al Babas, and it was constructed as a luxury community for foreigners back in 2014. But when the Turkish economy fell into disrepair, the project was stopped. Approximately 530 huge castles were left unfinished and completely empty. The only people interested in the ruined castle village now are tourists. The place is creepy, unbelievably massive, and looks like Disney World if it ran out of visitors and was abandoned. Number 3. The Chatterley Whitfield Mine. The Chatterley Whitfield Mine is an old, disused coal mine outside of Trent in the United Kingdom. Back in 1937, it was the biggest mine in the area and the first in the UK to produce 1 million tons of coal in the year. But, like with other mines around the world, its coal production came to a screeching halt in 1977. Just 2 years later, in 1979, the mine was turned into an underground museum. The rundown buildings were renovated, and the rusty old machines were restored to their original condition. But the museum didn't last forever. The issue was that the Chatterley Whitfield mine was connected to the Woolstanton Colliery pits, and they stopped producing coal in 1981. The pumps were turned off, and water levels began to rise. And because the fans inside the Woolstanton pits were turned off, methane began to build up. There was no way the museum could afford to upkeep of the pits, and so the gas levels became extremely dangerous. Visitors were banned from entering the Chatterley Whitfield mine in 1986 when it became too hazardous. The possibility of an explosion or accidental suffocation was too great. It's still abandoned today, only it's been sealed to prevent people from sneaking in. If you tried to enter, you would almost certainly never come out again. Number 2. German U-boat bunker. There is a U-boat bunker in Bremen, Germany, codenamed Valentin. This amazing bunker was used to produce German submarines back in World War II, but has since been abandoned and left a ruin. Bizarrely, not a single U-boat was actually built here. The problem was that in 1943, the Allied forces had gained air superiority. The Germans were having a very tough time building their own boats in shipyards because the Allies would find out. So, they built the Valentin bunker to build them in secret. Construction went on from 1943 to 1945, growing to be the biggest freestanding bunker in the whole country. It had 13 assembly bays, and the walls and ceilings up to 23 feet thick to protect the workers and assemblies. Unfortunately for the Germans, who used prisoners of war and prisoners of concentration camps to build the bunker, resulting in an estimated 1,750 fatalities, they lost the war before the bunker was finished. It was then left abandoned and is still empty to this very day. And number 1. The Omix civilization. One of the most interesting abandoned places in all of the Americas goes back to around 1600 BC. It's the ancient settlement of San Lorenzo, capital of the long-forgotten Olmecs, a group of people whose origins still mystify scientists. The name Olmec comes from the Aztec language. It means rubber people. Because of this, archaeologists believe that Olmecs participated in rubber processing. But what's really strange is that archaeologists haven't found a single skeleton of the Olmec person. It's as if they literally disintegrated or all floated away. The Olmecs crafted giant heads, some of them weighing up to 20 tons. But nobody knows why they built them, or how, and nobody knows why they abandoned their capital around the year 400 BC. The Olmecs came seemingly from nowhere, constructed a great city in what is now Veracruz, Mexico, and then faded like ghosts, leaving behind their abandoned temples and monuments, and not a single trace of skeletons. Number 10. The Nazi steamer. The Karlsruhe is an old Nazi steamer from World War II that was sunk by Soviet aircrafts in 1945. Today, the mysterious steamer is sitting at the dusty bottom of the Baltic Sea. The devastating attack by Soviet airplanes killed about 1,000 people on board. Just recently, a professional team of divers went down to check on the mysterious vehicle, which they believe may hold remnants of the famous Amber Room. The Amber Room is part of an unsolved mystery from the Great War. The Karlsruhe was built in 1905. 40 years later, she embarked on her last voyage with a team of heavy security and a very important load. Based on historical records, archaeologists believe the ship was carrying treasure from the Amber Room, an impressive space presented to Peter the Great of Russia back in 1716. The room was at Catherine Palace in Pushkin, filled to the brim with an unbelievable amount of incredible treasure. 200 years later in 1941, the Nazis looted the Amber Room. They stole all the goods and then rebuilt the room in Germany for themselves. But when Allied forces advanced in 1943, the Nazis took all the treasure out, put it into crates, and shipped it somewhere else. The treasure has not been found since. The archaeologists were hoping to find traces of the treasure inside the sunken Nazi steamer, though so far, they haven't found anything. Number 9. World War II desert plane. There is a mysterious abandoned airplane from World War II that crashed in the western desert of Egypt. It happened around 70 years ago. The vehicle is a Royal Air Force Kitty Hawk P-40, and only recently discovered amongst a vast sea of sand and rocks during a mining operation in the desert. It was found pretty much destroyed in a sea of rock and sand, and nobody is really sure how it got there. Captain Paul Collins, the British Embassy's defense attaché, said the airplane probably got lost and ran out of fuel. He believes the pilot responsible for the crash was Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping, who seemed to have made a flawless emergency landing in June of 1942. However, any trace of Captain Copping has yet to be found, suggesting he tried walking out of the desert to safety and was swallowed by the brutal and arid desert sands. He was only 24 years old at the time and in great physical condition. He may have made it quite far before collapsing from exhaustion. His bones are probably a few miles from the aircraft, though it's doubtful anyone will ever find them. Number 8. USS Lexington. The wreckage of the aircraft carrier, the USS Lexington, has been found 76 years after it was scuttled in battle. The battle happened about 500 miles from eastern Australia back in 1942. It was called the Battle of the Coral Sea, and there was some serious fighting between the United States forces and Japan. This particular ship was sunk by an American destroyer so that it wouldn't fall into the hands of the enemy. It's considered to be the first battle in history featuring these impressive giant aircraft carriers. Not only that, it is also considered to be the very first air and sea battle ever fought. The Japanese were headed to Papua New Guinea, hoping to gain control of the island and cut off all access to Australia. Allied forces had other plans, however, and intercepted the Japanese, launching airstrikes from carriers when Japan began the invasion. The battle lasted 4 long days until Japan was finally forced to retreat. The battle was brutal for both sides though, and the Americans paid a price too. Yorktown, a US carrier, was heavily damaged. It was struck by torpedoes and bombs, and a fire on board led to raging fires that no one could contain. 2,770 were evacuated that night, and the US made the decision to sink their own carrier so it wouldn't fall into Japanese hands. In total, 216 crew members were killed in the battle. The team that discovered the Lexington did so over the course of about 6 months. They found some other cool war relics too, like the mysterious Japanese battleship, the Musashi, and the USS Indianapolis. The team also discovered 11 of the original 35 aircraft that were on board the Lexington when it sank. Number 7. The giant K-7 bomber. The Russian K-7 bomber was a very peculiar aircraft built by the Soviet Union. It had its first flight only 3 decades after the Wright brothers broke the barrier between Earth and sky. The year was 1933, and the Russians were hoping to use the K-7 as a heavy bomber and gunship, since it was equipped with both. It was an unusual construction. It had mounted machine guns and the capacity to drop bombs. The designer was even a veteran pilot of World War I named Konstantin Kalinin. He designed the aircraft to have a massive wingspan, so big that even by today's standards, it was a giant. The wingspan was over 150 feet, even greater than a modern B-52 bomber. It also had 8 engines to carry its massive weight. The K-17 bomber ended up being a little too big though. During its maiden flight, it showed a concerning amount of instability. Its construction was solid, but there were just too many engines, and it was just too large. The frame of the vehicle shook dangerously because of all the engines vibrating. By the 11th time it took to the sky, it was completely toast. The aircraft experienced massive structural failure and crashed, killing 14 men on board and 1 guy on the ground. Do you think if we tried to build a plane like this today, it would be successful? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 6. The Vesticod. The Vesticod is yet another bizarre piece of Soviet military history. The vehicle was meant to be a highly advanced tank, the first ever built, but it was never actually made. The inventor of this gorgeous machine never got past a pre-production model. If he had, he may have changed the face of warfare. The inventor was Alexander Prokofshikov. In 1914, he wanted to create a cross-country tank. The idea was for the welded skeleton of the tank to run on a single caterpillar track made of rubberized fabric. The track was stretched over 4 drums, with 2 small wheels on the sides, controlled by the steering wheel. The weirdest part was how it looked. It had all the trademarks of a modern tank, but was extremely small and narrow. It was also a total failure in 1915 when the pre-production model went on its first road trip. It didn't perform like the inventor promised it would, and the funding was taken away. It wasn't until around 1941 that Russia began spreading nationalist propaganda that the Vesticod was the first tank ever built, designed by a Russian. The details of the history of the Vesticod can be found in Leonid Fedosyev's book, Tanks of the First World War. Number 5. The German Ball Tank. The German Ball Tank, also known as the Kugelpanzer, was designed by Germany in World War II as a one-man wrecking ball. Nobody knows exactly who invented the tank or how many were built, as historical records only show a single vehicle that was exported to Japan sometime in 1945. The vehicle is still a total mystery because there are no official records of its invention, and to this day, there's only one surviving model. It's currently stationed at the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow. It was captured by the Soviets and kept as an oddity. Today, it's known simply as Exhibit number 37. Nobody knows if it was ever used in combat or why it was built in the first place. Here's what it looks like. A ball. An armored ball. It was probably meant to be a light reconnaissance vehicle that could be manned by a single person. It used a single-cylinder engine and had armor about 5 millimeters thick. It also had a single viewing slot that the driver could use to see where he was going. It was almost like a portable bunker for a single person, though it was obviously not that useful since it never went into mass production, and nobody even knows where the thing was built. Number 4. The Foca Triebflüge. The Foca Triebflüge was a VTOL flight interceptor designed in the mid-1940s. This was at the very end of the war. The Germans were extremely desperate to try and build something far superior to the enemy's aircrafts. Turbojet technology was all the rage, and they wanted to create something that could take off vertically and land the same way. Thus, the Triebflüge, which translates roughly to the thrust wing hunter, was born. It was basically a rocket ship designed to intercept the legions of Allied bombers, inching closer to Berlin. Here's how the VTOL would have worked if it ever got off the ground. It had a single seat in the cockpit for one pilot directly under the nose. It had 3 wings sitting around the fuselage in the middle of the ship and oversized propeller blades with jets attached to their tips. This would have enabled vertical lift and forward flight. However, like so many of the mysterious vehicles designed during wartime, this one never saw the light of day. The war was already ending, and the process of getting the machine built and tested was just too much. The futuristic design was never seen all the way through, and just as the wind tunnel testing was being completed, the facility was taken over by the Allies. Number 3. Pigeon Rockets. In 1943, America was desperately searching for a way to bomb its targets in Nazi Germany. Inventor, B.F. Skinner, came up with a very bizarre vehicle for doing so. And yes, it involved pigeons and rockets. According to Peggy Kidwell with the American History Museum, military officials were desperate to figure out how they could aim rockets accurately. Skinner approached the Defense Committee with his plan, codenamed Project Pigeon. They then granted Skinner a small budget of $25,000 to get his project off the ground. The vehicle Skinner invented was fitted with a missile and 3 tiny cockpits to hold pigeons. In front of each pigeon was a small electronic screen that showed an image of the ground directly in front of the rocket. The street pigeons were to be trained to recognize a specific target and then peck at the launch button when they saw the target on the screen. When all 3 pigeons pecked their buttons at the same time, the missile could be fired accurately at the target. It seemed like the perfect missile carrier, but it didn't work. Well, it did and it didn't. There was a successful demonstration using trained pigeons, but the military officials thought it was a quack idea and shut down the project immediately. Skinner himself went on to become one of the most influential psychologists in the country. Number 2. Object 279. Object 279 was an experimental tank designed by the Soviets in the 1950s. It was a unique vehicle that used 4 sets of treads instead of the usual 2. It also had an extremely long cannon that it could use to blast apart just about anything in its way. The first prototype was born in 1957 in Leningrad, a vehicle that weighed 60 tons and whose primary function was to break through fortified enemy lines. It could also operate in extremely rugged terrain, where lighter tanks failed. She had a 133mm cannon, infrared sights, a radar rangefinder, and armored protection in the front that was 11 inches thick. This is huge in comparison to the American M60 tank, with its measly 6 inches of armor. Fortunately for everyone, politics in the 1950s saw the end of Object 279. The Russians realized that if there ever was another world war, it would not be using heavy tanks, and instead would be fought with nuclear bombs and advanced weaponry. The battlefield would be much different, and so they saw no need to build any more heavy tanks. Only one Object 279 was ever built. They were right, as a lot of battles today are fought from behind a computer screen. Today, Object 279 is sitting at a tank museum in Russia. And number 1, government UFOs. According to astrophysicist Eric Davis, a man who consulted the Pentagon on their UFO program years ago and who currently works for the defense contractor Aerospace Corporation, witnessed certain materials that likely came from outer space. At least, this is what Eric told The Times. He claimed the Department of Defense has collected materials from vehicles off-world, meaning they were not created by humans on Earth. However, he was not able to specify what these materials were being used for, or if the government was able to utilize them in such a way to create weapons or advanced vehicles. We also don't know if his claims are even true, but if what he's saying is real, it means the government has been collecting crashed UFOs and may be putting the technology to use in the weapons department. What that means for the future of warfare is anybody's guess.
Number 10. Robot Insect Army. In case you didn't think your tax dollars were going to fund worthwhile causes, check this out. The United States military is trying to create a robot insect army, at least something fairly similar. I don't know how I feel about that as a reasonable piece of research, but here's the deal. One of the most bizarre military projects going on right now involves artificial intelligence and small flying insects. We don't know the end results of the project because it's still ongoing, but we do know it began with DARPA reaching out to the scientific community to see if anyone was able to map the brain of an insect and figure out how the extremely complicated sensory and nervous systems of flying insects could translate to robotics. In other words, an army of robot insects. The idea is to create extremely tiny AI systems. Imagine a drone, except it's a fly and there are millions of them. They would operate with a type of hive mind protocol as a singular entity. We don't know how far the military has gotten with this bizarre project or what they even intend to use their robot army for. But besides, once they've assembled their army, they probably won't tell us anyway. Your tax dollars hard at work, ladies and gentlemen. Number 9. Military mind control. The United States military recently funded a project to create a helmet that can read minds. Oh yes, the military is diving deep into mind control. However, it's a bit different from what you might expect. The helmets are designed to allow soldiers to fly drones and to control other robots using telepathy. The idea is that once the helmet is on the soldier's head, it'll read the signals in the brain to operate the robot or whatever other piece of machine the helmet is connected to. Here's how the project got started. First, researchers in Texas are trying to make the helmet read the vision of a person and then transfer what they're seeing into the brain of a person who's visually impaired. In other words, the person wearing the helmet, whatever they're seeing, it'll be transmitted into the brain of a blind person. This is some seriously futuristic stuff. The helmet works by utilizing light and magnetic fields to interact with neurons in the brain. The ultimate goal is to have a scenario similar to the science fiction novel Ender's Game. If you've read the book or know the story, it would basically result in a single soldier controlling huge war machines while sitting in a room somewhere with a helmet on. Would you sign up to command real military equipment with your mind? It seems a little scary to me, but what do you think? Number 8. Augmented Doggy Reality. Dogs having a place in the military is nothing new. However, a new project being managed by the Army Research Office is trying to create cyborg dogs. Well, at least dogs that can make use of augmented reality. On the modern battlefield, military dogs are used to search for explosive devices and to help with rescue operations. However, a human is usually needed to be present to give the dog its instructions. Scientists want to create augmented reality goggles that can be placed on a dog's head so that its handler can give it commands remotely. How does it work? The augmented reality glasses are fixed to the dog's head. Think of it like the heads-up display in a video game. The handler will be able to transmit instructions to the goggles, which the dog then sees overlapped with the real world. Think of visual cues that the dog has been trained to follow. The dog will see commands come up in the goggles, telling it where to go, what to search for, and when to return to base. I don't want to see any friendly dogs get in harm's way more than they need to personally. Wouldn't you rather just have robots do these kinds of tasks? Or maybe people themselves? Then maybe we think twice before going to war in the first place. Number 7. The US Camel Corps. Way back in the 1830s, the expansion into the American West was difficult and dangerous. Moving from east to west involved inhospitable terrain, a bleak climate, and nearly impossible routes through desert, mountain, and river. To allow the Army easier passage into the West, Lieutenant George H. Crossman had the bizarre idea in 1836 to establish a Camel Corps, one of the weirdest experiments in the history of the U.S. Army. It wouldn't be until 1855 that Congress finally agreed to give $30,000 to purchase and import camels for military purposes. Soon after, the Navy transported a collection of camels to the United States for use as military transport. 33 camels were brought back, then months were spent acclimating the animals to their new home and teaching the locals how to properly care for them. It was when the military decided to build a road from east to west that camels came in especially handy. They could travel farther than horses and mules and could still carry about 700 pounds. They also traveled across the rough terrain more easily. They could go about 40 miles a day while only drinking water once every 2 weeks. However, by 1864, there wasn't much use for the camels anymore. There were some suggestions to use them for the postal services, but that never happened. It wasn't that the camels were useless or less useful than horses, it was just that people didn't really like them. They stank and had bad attitudes and, quite frankly, weren't as pretty as horses. In the end, the Camel Corps was scrapped and the camels were sold for $52 each. But just imagine if the camels were friendlier or had caught on with the soldiers and cowboys who lived in the Wild West. We could have a very different image of our frontier pioneers. Number 6. The Iceberg Boat. Back in the 1940s, German submarines were terrorizing the Allied forces, sinking their ships in the Atlantic Ocean and threatening to win the war with their powerful navy. The Allies wanted something that was too big to fail, and so a British inventor designed what came to be known as the Berg ship, an aircraft carrier carved out of an iceberg. It would be a giant, unsinkable ship, more like an island made completely out of ice. As insane as it is to think about, the prototype was actually approved by Winston Churchill, then built in secret. The inventor of the ship was Geoffrey Pike. He envisioned an aircraft carrier over 1 mile long and made entirely of ice. But it proved significantly harder than anticipated. The prototype was commissioned in 1943 and was to be constructed in Canada. A model was built on Patricia Lake in Alberta, 60 feet long and 1,000 tons. To create the larger vessel, scientists would need 35,000 tons of timber, 10,000 tons of steel, and 25,000 tons of insulation. Oh, and 300,000 tons of wood pulp. However, the projects kept getting more and more complicated and expensive. In the end, there just wasn't enough money or material to build the Iceberg Boat, and the plans were scrapped. Still, theoretically, the ship could be built today. I have to imagine that spending a lot of time and money to build an iceberg aircraft carrier only to have it eventually melt into the sea doesn't sound that appealing, though. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. North Korea killer dolphins. Evidence has recently emerged that in North Korea the military has begun training dolphins for an unknown but probably pretty nefarious purpose. Believe it or not, this isn't the first time a nation has tried to bring dolphins into the military. The Russians did it, and so did the US Navy, but that was a long time ago. Fighting dolphins are a thing of the past, except for apparently in North Korea. They're just catching up, folks. Plus, who doesn't want to work with dolphins all day? Satellite images revealed the program in North Korea date back to at least 2015, when a dolphin enclosure was spotted near a naval base on the west coast. North Korea has yet to comment on their bizarre dolphin program, but intelligence suggests it's part of the naval modernization that's been going on under the leadership of Kim Jong-un. What exactly the North Koreans are training the dolphins to do is arguably anybody's guess, but knowing them, it's probably pretty ridiculous. Number 4. Supersonic UFOs. Up until recently, UFOs have been strictly myths, along the same lines as the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. But after the US government declassified some documents, the public got their first look at something called Project 1794, when the Army tried to make their very own flying saucer. The government decided enough time had passed and released the actual schematics for a flying device that was part of an operation in the 1950s to make a sophisticated military vehicle. So what happened to the UFO? It was to be built by a Canadian company on Canadian soil, though the US was heavily involved. The saucer was to take off vertically, reach a ceiling of over 100,000 feet in the air, and reach speeds of Mach 4. It would have been an incredible device. But unfortunately, UFOs aren't really that practical. The government wasted about $26 million in today's currency on the project, only to have the UFO get about 5 feet, 1.5 meters off the ground. The plug was pulled in 1960 and the information was buried. Again, your tax dollars hard at work. Number 3. Zombie sharks. The US military has figured out how to create zombie sharks. At least they're trying to make zombie sharks. According to information from DARPA, they were working with Boston University on a project that involved controlling fish by electronically stimulating their brains remotely. In other words, they were turning the sharks into zombies by using a type of mind control. By stimulating the brain of a shark, particularly by stimulating their sense of smell, researchers could make the sharks move wherever they wanted them to go. This is obviously horrifying. If scientists can remotely stimulate an animal's brain to make it move in a certain direction and attack a certain target, it's only a matter of time until they figure out how to do the same thing with people, collecting an army of zombies. As for what became of the zombie sharks, the project actually went dark, and skeptics are fairly certain they must have made some kind of progress that they aren't interested in everyone else knowing about. What do you think? Are there likely to be armies of mind-controlled animals soon? What will the military do with them? Tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. Number 2. Superpowered Soldiers. A new smart contact lens is being developed as part of a military project to give soldiers superpowers. The device was revealed by an engineering school in France. They showed off what they called the very first contact lens with a micro battery. As you can imagine, this caught the attention of the US military. They're interested in using the contact lens to create the visual capabilities of troops on the battlefield. As you may already know, the military has been searching for some way to create an augmented contact lens for years, a way to dramatically increase what soldiers are looking at while in the field. Imagine having binoculars in the form of contact lenses while also being able to see at night, to read information transmitted to the lenses, and much more. The possibilities are endless, though the military hasn't actually revealed the exact capability of the lenses or when they'll be available for the soldiers to use. Number 1. US Dinosaur Army. Did you know that the United States military owns a shocking number of fossils? It actually began in the 1950s when the US Army Corps of Engineers built the Coralville Dam to provide flood protection for the Iowa River Valley. After they built the dam, they discovered a treasure trove of fossils dating back 375 million years on their property, revealed because of the floods before the dam was built. The flooding wiped away several feet of limestone to reveal the fossils beneath. According to Nancy Brighton, an archaeologist with the U.S. Army Corps, the military owns a collection of fossils that spans the entire paleontological record. They have everything from trilobites to dinosaurs. But what does this mean? Is the Army planning to create their very own Jurassic Park? Or what about an army of Tyrannosaurus Rexes? We don't actually have an answer for that. While it's definitely interesting to imagine what the military could do with a limitless supply of dinosaur bones, they haven't revealed any plans for creating any hybrids or bringing any creatures back to life. But that doesn't mean that it won't happen. 30 years from now, we could see soldiers riding into battle on some kind of shark-dinosaur hybrid, or cyborg mechanized T-Rexes in war zones to try to keep the peace in unstable areas. I know I wouldn't mess with something like that. Would you? What do you think the Army would do with living dinosaurs? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to hit the subscribe button for more great videos right here on American Eye.